Let's get started. Hello, everybody, and welcome to the San Anselmo Library's Virtual Art Talk Tuesday, Diego Rivera, Art for a New World. I'm Sariana. I'm the Adult Services Librarian at the San Anselmo Public Library. And before we begin, I'd like to thank the Friends of the Library and the Library Parcel Tax for sponsoring this program and all library programs. There are a few technical things I'd like to mention before we begin. Everyone will remain muted until the end of the presentation. If you have a question for Avril, please type it into the chat box at the bottom or top of your screen, depending on where you have the functions located and what device you are using. I will be monitoring the chat and will alert Avril to any questions received there at the end of the presentation. I recommend selecting the full screen and speaker view settings. This can be found in the top right corner of your screen or on the left-hand side, depending on your device. We are recording this program today, and I will send the link out to everybody who registered, hopefully later today. And thank you for your patience and understanding during this program. We are all learning the ins and outs of Zoom. If you have any questions or need help with Zoom, you can email me at sleyland@townofsananselmo.org. It's the same email you used to register for this event, or you can use the chat box and send me a personal chat. Our speaker today is Avril Angevine. Avril is an independent art lecturer, and she teaches English and humanities at local colleges. She's also a museum guide at the SF MoMA and Oakland Museum. Her particular interests are modern art and California art and design. Her website, talkingaboutart.net, has short videos about people and movements in California art. The picture behind her today is on the screen. Behind her today is Roy DeForest, country dog gentleman, because like Roy, Avril loves dogs. Please join me in welcoming Avril Angevine back to our virtual Art Talk Tuesdays.
Thank you, Sariana. I'm really happy to be here as always at San Anselmo. I wish I was in the adorable San Anselmo Library, but this is what we've got. So let's get started. I've already got myself on the screen here. That's great. So now, I know in the last month or so, you've probably learned a lot about Frida Kahlo, and you may well have gone to see the exhibit at the De Young, showing her art and life or materials. So I thought today I'd fill in about there's Frida, the other half of this powerful artistic pair, lovers, co-conspirators, artistic partners, and undoubtedly among the century's most important power couples, and that is Diego Rivera. Now, in their lifetime, Diego was by far the more celebrated figure. He was larger than life in every way. But in our time, Frida's reputation has surpassed his. Somehow, Frida transcended the fairly conservative time and place in which she lived and tapped into a feminist consciousness that had grown and flowered by the end of the century. Now, as you know, Frida's works are intensely personal. Most of them are self-portraits, and she had a tragic story, a compelling story, so that we feel connected to her, rather like we feel perhaps about someone like Vincent van Gogh. Now, although Frida denied being a surrealist, she said her works reflected reality, not surreality. Her mysterious canvases filled with symbols leave lots of room for speculation. Diego's works, on the other hand, especially his murals, are social, political in intention, and they reflect a worldview that had run its course by the century's end. This is one of his more famous panels called The Arsenal at the Education Ministry in Mexico City. So there's Frida in the center passing out weapons, Tina Modotti on the far right, and David Siqueiros on the left, and the banderole says, "This is what the revolution will be like," right? So that's his. So packed with imagery, his works, particularly his murals, the meaning of them is as clear as Frida's works are baffling. They reflect historical and contemporary reality as Rivera saw it. But in our current moment, with the resurgence of murals and other forms of street art that certainly ask us to attend to the world around us, Rivera's art has something to tell us. Now, in fact, Rivera and the mural movement that he was part of was something of an anomaly in the 20th century. Modern movements in Western art, beginning with the Impressionists in the 1870s, were far more concerned with form. That is, the way things were painted, the way objects were depicted, what the boundaries of art might be, more concerned with that form than with content, than with what was being shown. The Impressionists, of course, painted the world around them, but they developed new ways to paint, putting dabs of color next to each other rather than mixing them on the palette as the old masters had done, to acknowledge that light changes the way we see things in the world. So other people, Matisse, for example, decided that color could be used wherever you want, didn't have to be realistic. And we have people like Cezanne who are focusing on the shapes of objects more than anything else. Now, Spanish sociologist and art critic Jose Ortegui y Gasset called these new ways of depiction dehumanization, a deformation of reality that would force viewers to come up with new ways, new purely aesthetic ways to respond to art. So even early in the century, some went as far as abstraction. But what Ortegui Gasset calls dehumanization means that these modern artists gave up the right, or perhaps the obligation, to present uplifting content, far from using their canvases to tell us what to think, what was right, what was ethical. They just gave us geometry. Now, of course, in the early 20th century, artists, like all artists at all times, lived in a social and political world, and theirs was a world in turmoil with the first appearance of cars and planes and movies and Sigmund Freud clarifying everything for us. And in addition to that, World War I blasted people to their core. So artistic responses to the war, like Expressionism and Dada, were clearly modern forms of art, but they expressed outrage and angst for sure. But at this point, they weren't as politically pointed as what the mid-century muralists, whether Los Tres Grandes in Mexico or the WPA muralists in San Francisco, this of course, Life of George Washington, what they would do. In fact, it's only in the Soviet Union that you find sloganeering art as resounding as Rivera's, but yeah, I don't know. The Mexican muralists were great because they combined these two strands, modern form and political content, to produce a kind of fabulous hybrid. It was so successful, in fact, that the WPA in the United States followed the lead of the Mexican muralist tradition in using murals to decorate buildings and expand awareness of art. So let's go back a little bit and see where this worldwide phenomenon that was Diego Rivera came from. He was exceptional from birth. Diego and his twin brother, Jose Carlos, were born in 1886 in Guanajuato, a colonial city in the mountains of central Mexico that was once a silver mining town and is considered one of the most beautiful in Mexico. His twin brother died at 18 months, and their parents, fearing for little Diego's health, placed him with an indigenous wet nurse who also let a goat suckle him, as Rivera says in his autobiography. That could be the goat. When a sister was born, the family reunited and moved to Mexico City. Rivera's parents were teachers, and Rivera was brilliant at school. And by age 12, he was studying painting and sculpting techniques under the largely conservative faculty at the Academy of San Carlos, the oldest art gallery and art academy in the Americas, begun in 1781. Here's an early work of his, kind of his graduation exhibition work. So in 1906, when he was 20, he won a scholarship to study in Europe. So he soon found himself in Madrid at the San Fernando Royal Academy, Spain's most prestigious, where Francisco Goya had once been director. More recent students included Pablo Picasso, Salvador Dali, and anybody, Oscar de la Renta. Now, Rivera was mightily influenced by the dark Spanish masters Goya, Velázquez, El Greco, whom he studied at the Prado Museum. And in his early works, we can see, such as this one, they tend to be very dark. And he did this lovely self-portrait. I think very early work. And just to see, check out how good he is. Here's a picture of him, a photo of him at the same time. Love the hat. Um, After Madrid, he moved to Paris, where he began living the artist's lifestyle, painting in a fairly impressionist style and exhibiting and living in typical bohemian poverty and squalor. He spent 12 years in Paris, and he soon discovered and embraced Cubism. He met Piet Mondrian, and in fact, Rivera's first Cubist work, which was a watercolor of trees, was inspired by Mondrian's early experiments. Picasso was there. Picasso knew him, encouraged him, and approved of his work. But Rivera goes his own way, even as a Cubist. So in a work like this one, The Fountain in Toledo, it is using shape very freely, lots of color still, these lovely arcing lines, but in the landscape and in the figures in the front, and particularly the women at the lower right, there's a lot of movement in them. It looks like they're dancing. Let's see some more of his early Cubist type works. The Eiffel Tower, that's pretty good. The other one, the portrait of Adolfo Bess Mogar, is a really interesting work. This man was a poet and filmmaker and artist whom Diego knew. He's in Paris, he's in front of the Gare Montparnasse, and behind him, the Ferris wheel was for the 1900 World's Fair. And it's kind of interesting. There was a big emigre community of artists in Paris at the time, as there probably always is. And this is interesting, this portrait, because Mogard is separate from Paris. He's behind this barrier a little bit, as Diego was too, probably. So a couple of other of his Cubist works. There's a portrait there of the Mexican novelist Martin Luis Guzman. And you can see, particularly in there, there's a bit of the, what do you call, wicker work behind the chair behind him, which was something that they like to do. But we see the Mexican serape, the Mexican colors. So there's a lot more color in these works than is normal in the early Cubist artwork. And also, I would say in the portrait of two women, they're more separated from the background than we usually see. So as I said, he was very influenced by the role of art in the service of the revolution that was a topic of conversation among the emigre artists at the time. And Rivera made quite a name for himself in the movement with works like this one, the Zapatista landscape of 1915, which clearly has got Cubism going on. We have the fake wood in the center of the pattern. But again, Mexican elements, Mexican colors, and a real separation from the background. And in fact, in the background, we see the peaks that surround Mexico City. If you'd like to know how big that work is, here it is with Rivera at the time. And here's a portrait of Rivera by one of his emigre friends, Amedeo Modigliani, known worldwide for the long, thin faces he paints. But I guess Diego Rivera kind of, he had to work with what he got. It's a little rounder look. But by 1917, Rivera had had a serious disagreement with Picasso, and he abandons Cubism and looks instead at people like Cézanne, love this aqueduct, and looks more to naturalistic imagery, as we can see in a work like this Mathematician. Meanwhile, on the important personal front, while he was in Paris, Rivera married for the first time, first of 4 marriages, to a Russian painter named Angelina Beloff. And there she is in a kind of impressionistic style portrait he did of her. Their son, Diego, died of flu at age 2, and mother and son are celebrated in this work called Motherhood, which is kind of considered his last Cubist work. And as you can see, cubistical as it is full of color. And just kind of to remind you, this is like a Picasso or a Braque. At this time, their works had practically no color in them at all. So this is Diego. He's got a different look. So, okay, despite the rapid development of his work in these years, by the end of his time in Paris, Rivera still felt that something was absent from his work. And as Ortega y Gasset points out in his essay, Cubism and other severely modern types of art seemed only to be enjoyed by forward-thinking intellectuals. Rivera, on the other hand, felt that art should be enjoyed by everyone, particularly by the working class, by poor people, by kids, and so forth. And he felt that Cubism was inadequate to this goal. There were, he said, many elements that didn't fit the specific need. And his view of the political importance of painting was strengthening at this time, and he began to interest himself in the folk art and ancient masterpieces of Mexico, of his native land. And of course, after the war, after World War I, there was kind of a general return to a classically inspired realism among many European artists, including Picasso here and Giorgio de Chirico. Picasso himself spent 17 months in Italy, where he discovered the murals of the Italian Quattrocento and made over 300 sketches of them and of other works. In these murals, he found the inspiration for a new and revolutionary public art, capable of furthering the ideals of the revolution that had been happening in his native land. So, fired with enthusiasm, Rivera returns to Mexico in 1921, leaving behind his wife, Angelina, and a daughter, Marika, born to another woman, Marevna Vorobiev-Stavelska, and there's a picture of her there, and she does have kind of a triangular face, I think you'll see. She was actually considered the first female Cubist painter. And here's a work she did of Diego, which I think is one of the nicest portraits anybody ever painted of him. It's kind of cool. Now, although Rivera had visited Mexico more than once during his European years, his return in 1921 effected a change in his attitudes as well as his painting. He was overwhelmed by the beauty and richness of Mexico, and viewing it with fresh eyes brought different aspects to his attention. He said, "My style was born like a child in an instant after 35 agonizing years of pregnancy." And I think you can see in this lovely image, early image, when he came back to Mexico, that this is clearly Mexican subject matter, but it's presented in a very modern, very almost abstract style. And the plants and so forth around it, the richness of Mexico. He's on kind of a different path at this point. So in the early 1920s, with the armed Mexican Revolution at an end, the post-revolutionary governments created new institutions to shore up the social and political changes effected during the revolution. And an important person in this regard was the Minister of Public Education, Jose Vasconcelos. That's him at the far left, next to our star, Diego Rivera, of course, both of them with Panama hats. So Vasconcelos understood the importance of culture in the struggle to promote Mexican identity. He began an ambitious literacy campaign throughout the country and established a group of escuelas de pintura de aire libre, so open-air painting schools, to encourage creativity among the young and among workers. They had plastic arts, dance, theater. And most importantly, Vasconcelos wanted the state to sponsor murals on public buildings, big, bright, clearly understandable images that would be open to everyone to see and would illustrate for everyone the ideals of Mexicanness, Mexicanidad. Now, clearly, this project was tailor-made for Diego Rivera, and he understood the importance of this aesthetic revolution as well as anyone of his generation. In his mural projects, as well as his easel paintings, here's a lovely one, we see him combine sensitivity to Mexican culture and landscape, the pride he took in his Mexican identity, and a sophisticated modern technique that he had mastered in Europe, and turns out works of incredible power. So what became the Mexican muralist movement began when Vasconcelos assigned several well-known artists to decorate the Escuela Nacional Preparatoria, a demanding and prestigious Mexico City high school of 300 boys and 5 girls, one of whom was Señorita Frida Kahlo. This is where Rivera completed his first government-commissioned 1,000 square foot Renaissance-style mural called Creation over the course of a year, during which time apparently Frida Kahlo needled and teased him continually. So the figures are like 12 feet high, scaled in proportion to a huge pipe organ that surrounds the mural. And they're all allegorical. You need a program to understand what's going on. So at the top, there's a symbol that could be the Egyptian iconography of Aton, the symbol of the creative sun, or it could be the three hands of the three members of the Trinity. Below that, we see in the sky, we have wisdom and science. Below them, we have the Christian virtues. And lowest down on both sides, the 9 muses. So thus, it's a mixture of both religious and pagan iconography. And it's in the center section that Rivera's interest in Mexican subject matter comes across most clearly. Whoops, there's some of them close up. There we go. Unfortunately, it's behind the podium here. This is Adam and Eve. Eve is nude, of course. And the model for that was Guadalupe Marin, whom Rivera married in 1922. That's wife number 2. And it's full of luxuriant, again, the plants and animals that are in the fertility of Mexico. And the figures are more indigenous looking than the ones in the surrounding part. So his shift away from European inspired imagery can actually be attributed to Vasconcelos, who sent Rivera to Tehuantepec in southern Mexico in 1922. And the southern parts of Mexico were a revelation to the painter. So there was a lot of discussion about how to do these murals, and attempts were a little bit iffy to follow the Italian muralists because the materials weren't quite available. So Rivera came up with the idea to do this in encaustic, which is molten wax with pigment in it. And he used plenty of gold leaf on it. Now, despite the bright colors that are typical of Mexican indigenous art, Rivera felt that this was too Italian. And also, we can see that so far, there's no political or ideological tendency in this mural. However, that omission was rectified in 1922, following year, when Rivera, who had now joined the Mexican Communist Society and who had co-founded a revolutionary artist union, began a series of frescoes entitled The Ballad of the Proletarian Revolution, that of course focused on Mexican society and the country's revolutionary past, a series that he would not complete until 1928, because the finished work, 128 frescoes covering more than 5,200 square feet. It was enormous. This is installed in the 2 courtyards of Mexico City's Secretariat of Public Education building. So as you can see, they're on 3 levels. So there's 2 courtyards with 3 levels of images. So there's tons of them. The larger of the 2 courtyards is called the Labor Courtyard, where we can see images such as the liberation of the peon here, or mechanization of the country. There are even some panels in grisaille, in gray paint, dedicated to intellectual pursuits like chemistry, geology, and so forth, and one called The Painter, the Sculptor, and the Architect, in which Rivera considered to be one of his best self-portraits there, as he's considering some plans. And here is a photo of him at the time in an excellent hat at the Ministry of Education. Kind of interesting, at this point, Rivera painted small hammers and sickles next to his signature on the panels in this building. So that's the big courtyard. In the smaller courtyard, it's called the Fiesta Courtyard, we have depictions of traditional festivals, like the Festival of the Judases, which takes place in Easter week, and celebrations of labor, such as the Festival of the Distribution of Lands. Whoops, there we go. Wait. There we go. That's the Festival of the Distribution of Lands. And it's in the festival courtyard that we do find the Arsenal, this work, which is part of a series devoted to popular corridos, or revolutionary songs. Now, on the top floor, Rivera really lets rip his communist imagination, and we see all sorts of images of decadent capitalists drinking martinis, and here on the left, reading the ticker tape and so forth, images that will recur in some of his American murals. So the murals here at the Ministry of Education are, as we can see on the left, under a constant state of preservation. Now, we know that Diego Rivera was muy grande. In fact, he weighed 300 pounds, but he was only one of the three grandes, los tres grandes of Mexican muralism. And among these three, there are similarities and differences. They all trained in Europe. They all worked at that first project in the preparatory high school, and they all worked in the United States. But Jose Clemente Orozco, for example, his views of the revolution differed radically from those of Rivera, whom we know, or David Alfaro Siqueiros. So Orozco was disturbed by the bloodshed and death of the revolution and skeptical about its inability to benefit the poor, who, in his view, always, nobody really helped them. They would suffer no matter who came out on top. Orozco's focus on human suffering, no doubt related to his own personal story. His left hand had been amputated following an accident with fireworks. And in addition to what he witnessed during the revolution, which Rivera, for example, never experienced. He was in Europe at the time. Now, despite Orozco's empathy for humanity at large, apparently he had a notorious inability to connect with others, so that Mexican poet Octavio Paz once said that Orozco never smiled in his life. Certainly he didn't smile when he painted his own self-portrait here. So oddly, he challenges the nationalist sentiment that nevertheless provided him not just with work, but with fame too. So one of his first murals, of course, is this maternity that's at the preparatory school in Mexico City. And like Rivera's first work, this is also very European in flavor, with blonde figures flying around. And of course, Mary's cloak there is blue, which is traditional in Italian painting to put Mary in blue because the pigment lapis lazuli was very expensive. So we have a very Italian style, European style painting going on here, but he returned in 1926 with a different kind of outlook and added a new set of frescoes that include this work called The Trench. So this depicts revolution fighters, and it's in a quite different style. The forms are less three-dimensional looking. There's a lot of line used in it. And the palette is dark, kind of representing the dark, reflective of the dark content of the mural. So these three men could be three different soldiers. They could be a single soldier depicted in three different moments. It's not entirely clear. Now, Orozco was the first of the Mexican muralists to work in the United States. He was there in 1930, and he created this massive, massive mural at Pomona College in 1930. This is, I mean, a little bit intimidating for a dining hall, I think you'd agree. This is Prometheus. The Titan is about to give mankind the power of knowledge for which Zeus will punish him, as recounted in the Greek myth. Now, Jackson Pollock and Philip Guston, who both went to Manual Arts High School in Los Angeles, were known to have stood in front of this mural in awe. And another work of his called Dive Bombers and Tank, which was painted over 10 days in 1940 in front of an audience at MoMA, New York, where it is today. So again, this work shows that Orozco was more of a modernist than the other two greats. This is a fairly abstract work, which apparently the 6 panels can be reassembled in a different order. I don't know. And it lacks a narrative. So for example, over on the right, you see a couple of legs sticking up there. Is this an innocent civilian? Is this the pilot that has crashed? It's not quite clear what's going on, but it's a wonderful work. And it's cool to think of these guys painting in front of an audience. I love that. Now, David Alfaro Siqueiros is by far the most political of the three. He actually spent time in jail for his beliefs. He was thrown out of the US because of his beliefs, and he was expelled from Mexico for his role in the assassination of Leon Trotsky. So in 1914, when he was 18, he joined the rebel army, and during his travels around Mexico with the military, he really discovered pre-Hispanic art, and he witnessed also the living condition of Mexican laborers. And these two things together would deeply inform his art. He also received a grant to study in Europe in 1919, where he was, of course, impressed by Cubism and Futurism, as well as the Italian frescoes that had so impressed Rivera. In fact, Siqueiros met Rivera in Paris, and they became fast friends. When Siqueiros returned to Mexico in 1922, they founded the Artists Union together. And of course, he was engaged as a muralist at the preparatory high school. And on a staircase ceiling, he created this monumental winged figure surrounded by representation of the four elements, right? Fire, wind, water, with the shells and earth down at the bottom, depiction of Mother Nature and her realm in these intense colors that maximize the contrast with the simple background, a very weighty, very plastic figure, unlike the flat forms of, say, Rivera's mural. This clearly reflects his understanding of traditional European painting. So like the other two, Siqueiros' first mural at this school is very European in style and not political yet. Okay, so Siqueiros also went to LA in 1932, where he experimented with lots of new painting techniques using airbrushes and projectors and things like that. And with a team, he painted 2 murals in Los Angeles. So the first one is called Street Meeting, a group of workers on their lunch break listening to a labor agitator. This mural was whitewashed within a year or two of its unveiling, possibly due to weather-related problems, but most likely due to the pro-communist content of the work. It is still there, covered over the whitewash. It's been discovered, but it hasn't been conserved or anything yet. But the other big mural he did, Tropical America, was on Olvera Street, which is the traditional Mexican heart of Los Angeles. That is not Siqueiros in the picture. I don't know who it is, just a lucky guy who happened to be there. So this mural was intended to show the abundance of the tropical lands, you know, fruit falling into waiting hands and things like that. But guess what? Instead, it became a polemic against American imperialism with a crucified indigenous person at the center. And like his other mural, this one was considered by some, probably by many, as communist propaganda, and it also was whitewashed in 1938. Fortunately, 80 years later, the Getty Conservation Institute did restoration work on the mural, and it became accessible to the public in 2012. But it's conserved, not recreated. They didn't even have color photographs of it, so they weren't certain what colors were used. So they just kind of went for it. And what you actually see is this. It's a digital rendering that's projected onto the building, but it's still very cool. So Siqueiros is interesting. In 1936, he was in New York, where he led an experimental workshop. He was influenced by surrealism, automatism, and psychoanalysis at the time. And his course included an exercise where canvas was placed on the ground and a can of paint with a hole punched in it was sprinkled over it. And he called this controlled accident. Sounds familiar. Jackson Pollock was actually an attendee at the program. There he is on the right. And you can see the impact of this exercise on Pollock's practice. His drip paintings is evident. So Siqueiros' largest project, which was done in the late 60s, his most ambitious piece, The March of Humanity on Earth and Towards the Cosmos, an immense work that would occupy over 4,000 square meters. It's considered the largest mural ever painted in the Poliforum Siqueiros, it's called, in the World Trade Center in Mexico City. Combination of architecture, mural, and sculpture. The exterior has 12 panels of sculpture and painting, and the interior walls and ceiling house the mural, which visitors can experience while standing on a rotating stage listening to Siqueiros narrate. It's a massive thing. Okay, but let's get back to Diego Rivera. In 1927, we find him visiting the Soviet Union to celebrate the 10-year anniversary of the October Revolution, where he met Alfred H. Barr, director of the Museum of Modern Art in New York, who would become a friend and patron, as we'll see. On his return to Mexico City, Rivera divorced his wife, second wife, and married Frida Kahlo. And he began an important cycle of murals in the National Palace, a panorama of Mexican history, beginning before the conquest and continuing until the present, including tensions between Mexico and its neighbor to the north. Massive, massive piece of work. He also began work on a series of murals for the American consulate in the Palace of Cortez. Yes, that Cortez in Cuernavaca. This is the oldest civil building in the Americas. And this was commissioned by the American ambassador, Dwight Morrow. These two commissions really signaled the beginning of the real institutionalization of the Mexican muralist movement. So the political nationalists of the PRI, which ruled Mexico from 1929 till the year 2000, saw these murals as a way of documenting an official nationalist vision of Mexico and its rebirth. However, Rivera's relationship with American capitalists, such as the ambassador Dwight Morrow, led to his expulsion from the Mexican Communist Party in that year. And it's at this point that Frida and Diego arrive in San Francisco. And here he is recording his first impressions. Now, despite Rivera's strained relationship with the Mexican Communist Party, they were refused visas until Albert Bender stepped in. Bender, who came to San Francisco from Ireland as a teenager, became quite wealthy in insurance and began buying and giving away art. So many of the early acquisitions at SF MoMA, known as the San Francisco Museum of Art at the time, were given or bequeathed by Bender, and he deserves credit for helping Ansel Adams at the start of his career. But the biggest thing he did was to secure a visa for Diego Rivera and Frida Kahlo to come to San Francisco. Now, although we are rightly proud of Rivera's San Francisco murals now, his presence in town was not universally welcomed. Despite being an important labor town, communism was not necessarily embraced by everyone in San Francisco, and many people thought that mural commissions should go to local artists. And in addition to that, his style was radically different than the local landscape-based decorative mural style that we see in people like Gottardo Piazzoni and Arthur Matthews. But Bender, in addition to donating these two wonderful works by Frida and Diego to SF MoMA, sponsored an exhibit of Rivera's mural sketches in towns up and down California. So people got used to looking at him and looking at his style of work, which is so actually incredible. Now, if Rivera was unpopular with Bohemian Club bigwigs, he had an outsized influence on local artists. He and Frida stayed in sculptor Ralph Stackpole's studio, where many local artists met him, including a young David Park. So here he is at work on a fresco. So the first one, Creation, was done in encaustic. Since then, he got into fresco, true fresco techniques, where the drawing is made on rough plaster, and then finished plaster is spread on small areas at a time, basically as much as you can do in a day. While the plaster is wet, the color is applied, so it's pigment mixed with water. And of course, this works best with fairly simplified forms, which Rivera uses, and it's permanent. The pigment becomes part of the plaster. So this is an Italian tradition, but interestingly, it was also used in Mexico at Teotihuacan, right? Pre-Columbian art, where the paintings were laid down also on lime plaster over clay, dominated by red, but there are other colors, blues and greens appear. And as you can see, the style is flat and fairly linear. He was also influenced by Toltec imagery, pre-Columbian imagery in general, in which figures are wide and squat. And that's the way he draws people frequently. Okay, so in San Francisco, his first mural is the Allegory of California at the Stock Exchange. There it is, this fabulous work. This was originally planned to be in the lobby of the Art Institute, but it was moved indoors to a building that Stackpole at the moment was designing huge sculptures for the outside. And it goes all the way up to the ceiling. It's quite incredible. Now, despite the title, it isn't really an allegory because it's filled not with symbols, but with contemporary figures, some famous like Luther Burbank, and others just unsung workers whom Rivera spent weeks sketching in the field. And even the enormous figure of Khalifa is not really an allegory. It's an image of local tennis star Helen Wills Moody, with whom Rivera tooled around San Francisco in a convertible sports car at the time. The mural seems to celebrate California's natural wealth and industry. Let's look back at it here. But rather than a consistent whole, the mural is a collection of parts, partially because of the difficulty in seeing it whole due to its vertical setting and in a staircase as well. Design-wise, it has this serpentine structure from the miners at the lower left through the trio of famous men, John Marshall and Luther Burbank there, up to right in the center, the portrait of young Peter Stackpole with his airplane, through to the engineer and toolmaker, and then the serpentine is stopped by the giant figure of the woman. In early sketches, the female figure looked much more like Rivera's Mexican subjects. Now here is a close-up sketch of Peter Stackpole, the boy in the center with the airplane, which I just love this. And if you have ever seen photographs of the Bay Bridge and the Golden Gate Bridge being constructed, those early photographs, they were taken by Peter Stackpole when he was about 17. It was just like a lot going on at the time. So his next mural in San Francisco is Flowering Almond Trees that was done at the Atherton home of Rosalie Stern, where Frida and Diego were house guests for a while. This was moved from there to Stern Hall, which is a dorm at UC Berkeley in 1956. So we have Rosalie Stern's grandchildren here. The boy kneeling in front of the tree is Walter Haas, and the other two are Rhoda and Peter Haas. The little girl at the left is Rhoda's imaginary friend. Rivera was kind enough to include her, right? So that's number 2. The third mural he did here is the making of a mural about the creation of a city. This was his first publicly accessible mural in the States, right? At the Art Institute. And there was a bit of controversy about this because of his presence, the presence of his hind end, predominantly up there in the picture. But he said, since I was facing my work, the portrait of myself was a rear view with my buttocks protruding over the edge of the scaffold. Some persons took this as a deliberate expression of contempt for my American hosts. However, I insisted that my painting meant nothing else than what it pictured. I would never think of insulting the people of a city I had come to love and in which I had been happy. That's what he says. So after a short return to Mexico, the couple went to New York, where the second one-man show in the new Museum of Modern Art, the first had been devoted to Matisse. The second one was devoted to Diego Rivera and would show 5 portable murals. Whoops, there's the head up there. I keep forgetting that guy. 5 portable murals that Rivera made on site in the 6 weeks before the show. And this is one of them. It's one of MoMA's prized works. Nearly 60,000 people saw this show in New York. And after that, it was on to Detroit, where Rivera was to paint murals at the Detroit Institute of the Arts. The theme was Detroit industry, which mainly meant the Ford plant, where Rivera spent 3 months touring the plant, preparing sketches and concepts for the mural. He was absolutely amazed by the technology and modernity of Detroit's plants. So he worked there for 9 months. He and his crew worked tirelessly and completed 27 panels, which Rivera considered his best work. There was a strike there at the time. His own workers struck for more pay, and all of this charged atmosphere of protest against one of the world's largest and most powerful industries really affected Rivera, and his depiction of the scene has a decidedly leftist bent to it. So remember that this was during the Depression, when there was a great deal of sympathy for the plight of workers and a lot of intellectual sympathy for Marxism, generally speaking. So his works were often in this way tolerated, but of course not always. So famously in October 32, Rivera was commissioned to paint a mural at Rockefeller Center. And this time his big frame was right in the sight of critics. The explicit communist sympathies of this work with Lenin over there and the working, whoa, there we go, there's Lenin on one side, and once again, the decadent rich with martinis and John D. Rockefeller and so forth. This was just too much to ignore. And the mural was destroyed, what the part he made was destroyed in 1934. Nevertheless, he was able to use photos of it to paint a replica in the Palace of Fine Arts in Mexico City. So Rivera and Kahlo returned to Mexico in 1933. Kahlo was happy to be home, but Rivera missed the adulation he received in the US. He had no mural commissions between 1936 and 1940, but he devoted his time to easel painting, and life was busy. So Rivera at the time had an affair with Kahlo's sister, Christina. Kahlo had affairs with men, such as the sculptor Isamu Noguchi, with Leon Trotsky, the exiled communist who was living in her family's blue house at the time. And she had affairs with women, such as the actress Dolores Del Rio, and she moved out of their home. But despite the tensions between them, Rivera was always Kahlo's greatest fan, proud of her increasing fame and acceptance. And for her too, Rivera always came first. Still, they divorced in 1939, at which time Rivera was having an affair with actress Paulette Goddard, wife of Charlie Chaplin. He explained himself this way: "I have never been a faithful husband. I love her," meaning Kahlo, "far too much to want to keep inflicting suffering on her. All I really wanted was to be free to turn to any women who took my fancy." For her part, Kahlo once said, "I have had two catastrophes in my life, the bus accident and Diego Rivera." In May 1940, an assassination attempt had been made on Trotsky, and in August, he was murdered. Rivera left once again for the US, claiming that he had been suspected in the attack. In fact, he had already received an offer from architect Timothy Pfluger, delivered to him in Mexico by SF MoMA's director, Grace McCann Morley, to paint what would be his largest work and his last in the US, the fabulous Pan American Unity, painted in front of onlookers at the Golden Gate International Exposition in 1940 that was held on Treasure Island. It took him 4 months with 15 assistants to do this incredible work. So the theme of it basically is the fusion of the two American cultures, North and South, in the face of the destruction of Europe during World War II. So here's his thoughts. So he feels that in order to make a real American art, we need a blend of the art of the Indian, the Mexican, the Eskimo, with the machine, the urge that makes the machine, which is also an artistic urge in a different form of expression. So let's have a look at this sensational work. So it's in 5 panels, or actually 10 panels, because they're upper and lower. We'll kind of look at them here. There's 3 of them. So on the left, number 1, we see images of Mexico's indigenous past and all the gods. And up at the very top, of course, the peaks that surround Mexico City that we saw all that time ago in his Zapatista landscape. In number 2, which is so interesting, we have this young woman, Helen Kurlenkovich, who was a diver at City College. And there she is arcing over San Francisco. Below that, kind of incredibly surrounded by people in bathing suits, we have sculptor Mardonio Magana, a peasant artist described by Rivera as the greatest contemporary Mexican sculptor, at work on the head of Quetzalcoatl. And in the lower section, we have Rivera, and he appears 3 times in this mural, doing portraits of the great liberators, Washington, Jefferson, Hidalgo, and so forth, Bolivar. The 3rd panel on the right here, which is the central panel, has this incredible figure, which is a combination of the Aztec goddess Coatlicue, the Earth Mother, with a Ford plant stamping machine. And to him, this symbolized the union between North and South. Now, in the lower part of this panel, we do see Frida Kahlo, who was painted in after she joined him in San Francisco. And when you get to see this mural IRL in real life, you will see she's wearing a pair of earrings made of hands that were given to her by Pablo Picasso. So you would wear that when you're painted in a mural. Now behind her, once again, is Rivera with Paulette Goddard, the Mexican man and the American girl in ties of friendship, as he said, and they're planting a tree of love and life. Further over to the right, the man in the suit there is Timothy Pfluger, the architect, holding in his hand plans for the community college library where the mural was intended to go, but it was never built. He died suddenly in World War II, put plans like that on hold. So the last two panels, once again, we see the diver going in the opposite direction. With this time she's over Treasure Island. And below we have scenes from what he called that typical art form of the North, the movies, from Charlie Chaplin's film, The Great Dictator, and so forth. Rivera saw movies as murals too, as moving kind of murals that could instruct as well as his did. And the fifth panel is a parallel to the first one, showing the great technological genius of the North. Now, this gigantic mural is 73 feet long and 22 feet high, and it was designed to be portable. It's made of rigid steel frames and steel screening, which the plaster is laid onto. The total weighs 22 tons, and it was actually sized so that it would fit on a truck so that it could go through the tunnel into San Francisco, where it was intended to be installed. That didn't happen until 1961. Now, as you probably know, this work is in the process of being moved to SF MoMA, where it will be installed in the Roberts Gallery, so visible from outside, and you can go in for free and look at it. This should have been here already, but this year everything is topsy-turvy, and it'll probably be installed by spring. They're doing repair work and restoration, and I think actually building a totally new building of the theater at City College. And so the mural is going to be here while that's going on, and it will eventually go back to CCSF, where it will look like this in the new building, hopefully. So 1940, eventually, Frida and Diego are remarried. They're now living together in the Blue House. They were both appointed instructors at the recently opened Academy of Painting and Sculpture. And here, for example, are a pair of selfies asked for by Sigmund Firestone, a collector. Kahlo at this time was indeed exhibiting and gaining recognition, but the tempestuous relationship with Rivera was always on her mind, as we know in many works of this period. We see Diego appearing. And it's interesting, though, to track the change in their relationship by looking at their wedding portraits. So in the first one, little Frida is there being patronized, we might say, by Diego, but in the second one, in the later wedding, it's Frida who has the upper hand here. This is interesting. She developed a sort of motherly attitude towards this man who was even then carrying on with yet another Mexican actress. She said things like, "He's my child, every minute, my very own." And Rivera himself seems to have acquiesced in this relationship, because in the last of his great frescoes painted for a hotel in Mexico City called Dream of a Sunday Afternoon in Alameda Park, we can see right in the center of this work an interesting image. So the skeleton is La Calavera Catrina. This is a figure that portrays or parodies vanity, created by the man just to her right, Jose Guadalupe Posada, who was kind of a cartoonist and engraver whose work was very much appreciated by Diego Rivera. On the other side, the little boy there is indeed Diego Rivera at age 10. And behind him, looking like his mother, is in fact Frida Kahlo, in one of the loveliest pictures he ever painted of her, based, of course, on this photograph, taken of her by her lover, the photographer Nicholas Murray. It's just way, way, way complicated and very interesting. Okay. Now, this work was banned for 9 years because it showed a writer holding up a sign that said God does not exist. Eventually, Rivera painted out the inscription so the work could be displayed, but he maintained his own public commitment to atheism. As he said, I don't believe in God, but I do believe in Picasso, as we all do. So in the late 40s, it was early 50s, was a busy time for Rivera, and he was doing a lot of easel paintings like these. It's rather a lovely image. Here's rather a harsh one of his second wife, Lupe Marin. And a series of paintings that will astound you, being by Diego Rivera, some sunsets from 1956. Meanwhile, in 1950, Rivera, Orozco, and Siqueiros represented Mexico at the Venice Biennale. He was still doing mural and mosaic projects in Mexico City. And in fact, Kahlo, when she returned from a year in the hospital, served as a model in this work called Nightmare of War, Dream of Peace, that was to accompany an exhibition of Mexican art to Europe. Rejected. Rivera was welcome in Europe, but the mural showed Stalin and Mao, and they were not, so that never got there. And this is an interesting work from 1954 called The Glorious Victory, which is depicting a coup that the CIA backed in Guatemala with John Foster Dulles right there in the center. Now, in 1958, Rivera loaned this to the Pushkin Museum in Moscow, and it was out of sight for 50 years. It was only brought out in 2018 for an exposition there. And the reason was that Mexican art, even by these avowed communists, was considered formalist art, a derogatory term for works that were not subject to public display for ideological reasons. So it's kind of interesting, but there it is. So in April 1954, Kahlo died at age 47. Rivera apparently was beside himself and wept openly at her cremation. He fell into despair and aged rapidly, people say. He continued to venerate Kahlo and regard her as a supreme artist, which didn't stop him from marrying again in 1955. So that's number 4. But 3 years after Kahlo's death, Rivera himself died of a heart attack in his studio. He had wanted his ashes to be mixed with Kahlo's, but this wish was not granted. Instead, he was enshrined with great ceremony in the Rotunda of the Illustrious Men at the Dolores Cemetery in Mexico City. According to the New York Times, 20,000 people viewed his coffin in the Palace of Fine Arts, and 2,000 attended the ceremony, including a band of ardent communists who held up a red banner. So, like Frida, or with Frida, Rivera lives on, helped by the 10,000 works he painted in his life. This is the last one he did. And he has been, of course, an active presence in culture, and has appeared in several movies. Here he is played by Ruben Blades, or Ruben Blades if you prefer, in The Cradle Will Rock, and there he is by Alfred Molina in Frida. And we should remember him and honor him, I think, not just as a cultural figure, not just as the man behind Frida Kahlo, but for the incredible impact he had on American art, especially in San Francisco, where the mural tradition was so strong. We should remember him for the beauty and power of his images, which brought Mexico and its culture to the attention of the art world in the 20th century. And finally, we should remember him for the superhuman effort it must have taken over and over again to paint outdoors, to paint on scaffolds, to paint on ceilings, to paint in stairwells, to paint on the ceiling of stairwells, and to do it so extraordinarily well. So that is the story of Diego Rivera. We'll stop the share. And Seriana, if anybody has any questions, I would be happy to try and answer them.
Thank you so much for that presentation, Avril. It was lovely. I've always loved Diego Rivera and Frida Kahlo especially, but he is an amazing painter in his
Yeah, he's an amazing painter.
right. Yeah. Does anybody have any questions? Please type them into the chat box and Avril can answer them for you. I'll do a little chatting while if people want to type in some questions right now. This presentation was recorded and I will upload it to our YouTube channel and send it to everybody who registered, hopefully later today. It sometimes takes a little bit of time to upload to YouTube, but I'll get it to you guys later today and you can share it with your friends if they want to learn about Diego Rivera. And there was another thing I wanted to say and I forgot, but that's it. Yeah. Thank you everybody for coming. And I don't see any questions in the chat box. Does anybody have anything?
Okay. Okay.
April?
Must have covered it all. He was, just to say at the end, he was a fabulous artist. I'm not sure I would want to have met him. Kind of a difficult guy, but a genius. There's a little video on SF MoMA's website with the artist Rupert Garcia talking about Frida's work and Rivera's, and he calls him a monster artist. And I think he probably is. This is like an extraordinary, when you look at a lot of his work, the artistic skill is just absolutely stunning. So we will be seeing some of it. You know that SF MoMA, in addition to the mural, has an exhibit planned, Diego Rivera in America, which was supposed to be in the spring, but now it's been pushed back, but it will turn up eventually and we'll be able to see a lot of these works closer up, I hope. So
I hope so too. If nobody has any questions, I will end this meeting and just thank you all again for coming and joining us today, and stay safe and healthy and warm. It's really cold.
Yeah, no, it's cold. Yeah. Okay. All right. Bye, guy.
Bye.
Bye. All right.